Time and Tide by Misdemeanor1331. Chapter 7. Hermione apparated them to the centre of Malfoy Manor's drawing room. A deathly quiet hung over the manor, its interior dark despite the noontime sun shining outside. A shudder crawled down Hermione's spine, and sweat broke out beneath her arms and across her palms. They shouldn't be here. This place was wrong, and it would bring them nothing but pain. Draco dropped her hand, though Hermione was uncomfortable enough that she wouldn't have minded holding onto him a little while longer.
This way.
Draco kept his wand unlit, comfortable with the dark, twisting hallways of his childhood home. Hermione stayed close behind, unreasonably afraid of getting lost. They moved quickly and quietly, the fall of their footsteps prompting whispered questions from some of the portraits. They ignored the comments, hurrying up the curving stairs and turning west. Light flickered through a partially cracked door at the end of a dark hallway. An iron ridge miasma hung in the air. Draco stopped, his hands curled into fists. Draco! She wanted to help him, but didn't know what to offer. Her fingers drifted towards his, and the back of their hands brushing prompted him into movement. He strode down the hall like a man approaching the gallows, long since resigned to his fate. Hermione kept a step behind him until they reached the cracked door. Then he held out a staying hand. It felt wrong to let him go alone. She took his wrist. He looked back at her, eyes flickering like silver candles in the unsteady light. An understanding beneath words passed between them, and Draco turned away from her. Together they rounded the threshold. Scabia had been telling the truth. The scene defied sense. Hermione's eyes could not rest for too long in one place before instinctively moving to another, lingering only long enough to register the whole of the carnage without letting her identify its component parts. Draco's breathing quickened. When the sound of air wheezing through his throat finally broke through her numbness, he was in the midst of a full-blown panic attack. Hermione dragged him from the room and followed him to the floor. He sank against the wall, folded uncomfortably. Knees at his chest, elbows past his knees, head sunk into his hands. She'd had her share of panic attacks and had watched others in the order dissolve in similar ways. The only way out was through. There was nothing she could do but be present. With some effort she shifted Draco away from the wall and placed herself behind him. She spread her legs and moved close, wrapping her arms around his heaving chest and placing her cheek on the flat space between his shoulder blades. Jenny often got like this, late at night, when she lingered too long on how much she had to lose. They would sit together for hours, breathing and crying, trading deep-seated fears and secret dreams that bordered on hopeful. Hermione closed her eyes and focused on her breathing. Her inhales were deliberate, her exhales purposeful, and the movement of her chest against Draco's back forced him to match her cadence. Once he'd steadied, she lifted her head and dropped her arms. She drifted away from him, breaking all contact. She needed to separate herself from reality, to somehow ignore the fact she'd been the one holding him together as he threatened to shatter. To forget that she'd fulfilled the part of the silent contract that had allowed her access to the manor in the first place. Draco, however, was unable to achieve the same level of detachment. He couldn't meet her eyes.
We can't stay here,
he said to his shoes. I know. What do you want to do with? She swallowed thickly. Only a request from him would make her enter that room again. He would not do it on her own.
Wait here.
Draco staggered to his feet like a man 3 times his age, moving as though his very bones ached. Slowly he walked back into his parents' bedroom. Hermione pressed the heels of her hands into her eyes, the sting of tears hot behind them. Draco's footsteps were halting. She heard multiple clatters and sharp tinkling sounds like small glasses being shattered. He rejoined her in the hallway after a few minutes, 2 wands clutched in his left hand, a small edged box in his right. Didn't offer an explanation as to what was inside of it, and she didn't ask. Hermione followed him through the abandoned manor once more, the shadows receding as light began to penetrate the windows. He shoved open a pair of double doors and backed away, allowing her an unobstructed view of the Malfoy library.
Dark texts on the left, magical histories in the middle, family histories on the right, he explained. Take what you want, but don't take long.
She stopped, gaping long enough to catch her sleeve. Where are you going?
To take care of the elves.
His tone made her cold. Her grip tightened. You're not going to kill them.
No,
he said, clearly insulted.
Lettering, by the way. Thanks for that.
She shrugged away his indignation. They're property to you, she said lightly.
They raised me,
he encountered.
I'm going to let them go or send them to Hogwarts, their choice, but it needs to happen before ownership passes to my aunt.
Go then, she said, turning back to the library before he could see the tears in her eyes. He continued to underestimate him. Would she ever understand his true measure? I'll be fine here. He walked away, and Hermione lost herself amid the shelves, skimming through the titles and choosing any that sounded promising. After a confirmatory glance, she either tossed the tome onto the ground or set it in a hovering stack behind her. He made it halfway through the dark section when Draco returned.
It's time to go.
What, I haven't? He gathered the floating books and shoved them into his backpack.
You have enough.
He looked at the room's opposite side. What about your family histories?
Let them burn.
Burn? And that's when she smelled the smoke. Hermione looked at Draco in horror, taking his hand as she stepped down from the rolling ladder. What have you done?
Secured my legacy.
He said with a grim smile.
The property charms can't protect against faint fire.
Hermione went cold and looked at the fortune of books around her. It would be all lost. Why?
Because if I can't have it, then no one can.
He grabbed her arm, and they wound through Malfoy Manor in a half-jog. The fire caught behind them, its roar growing in intensity until it shook the portraits from the walls. Shouts and curses from Draco's ancestors chased them down the halls. Pleas for help and rescue consistently ignored. Vases shattered, knocked from their position up on decorative end tables, and there was a distant crash as a suit of armor tipped over. The hallways filled with thick, black smoke. They ducked to escape its sting. By the time they reached the newer garden, Hermione felt heat against her back. Couldn't claim to like Malfoy Manor. Only memories of the place were filled with pain, blood, and death. But neither did she feel joy in its loss. The old house was beautiful in a unique Gothic way, full of irreplaceable and invaluable history. A history from which Draco had permanently divorced himself. He tugged her into motion, but she resisted, pulling him to a stop. Draco had agreed to defect with her. He'd saved her, married her, kissed her, burned down his entire life. Everything he'd ever had. Without a second thought and seemingly without regret. Ever since they'd met, Hermione thought she'd known a single, inviolable truth about Draco Malfoy. But after all she'd witnessed and all they'd been through together, she had to wonder. Had she been wrong? I disgust you, she said, more statement than question. My parentage, my dirty blood, you hate me.
No, it's not the time,
he said with a growl. You just burned it down. He threw an arm out at the manor. Glass shattered as the force of the fire blew out the window. You destroyed everything you had, everything you've ever known. If now isn't the time, then when is?
Perhaps when we haven't lit a beacon for my mad aunt. Besides, it wasn't worth keeping.
None of it.
I saved what mattered.
He was avoiding her question, skimming the surface without dipping even a toe below the waterline. The careful answer of a practiced liar. Draco. Their eyes met. We've come all this way together. I need to know. I deserve to know. He glared, then looked past her. Something hooked his gaze, tugged him past aggravation and into introspection. His eyes grew unfocused for a moment.
"You were never what I expected,"
he said, almost to himself.
"You were always more. Smarter, faster, cleverer. A yardstick I could never meet. Didn't understand it then, how you were everything I was taught you couldn't be. You defied sense, defied nature. But now—"
His eyes refocused, shifted to her, and the feeling behind them made her heart lurch.
"Now I think I'm starting to."
It was hardly a declaration of friendship. Hell, it was barely more than forced tolerance. But she took it anyway, a secret held safe. A vine of trust creeping across the desert between them. Okay, she nodded. Okay. He muttered something she didn't catch and tugged her back into motion, leading her toward a rear shed that was as large as a single-family house. Silent spell caused the lock to explode from the latch. The door swung wide. Inside, arranged in neat racks, were brooms of every make, model, and size. Draco held out his hand, wordlessly summoning a firebolt with golden tail twigs and a handle that had been polished to a high sheen. He looked at her, expectant. He grabbed the one nearest to her, dark cherry with a white tail, not nearly as sleek or streamlined as the one Draco had chosen. Hopefully that meant it was slower. Draco raised an eyebrow at her choice, but said nothing. He cast a quick incendiary charm over his shoulder as they left, and Hermione followed him into the sky. Set himself hovering and stared with dispassionate eyes at the wreckage of his former home. The fiend fire had consumed the structure with a roar of whipping flames. Hermione flinched at the boom of a small explosion, jerking on the broom and sending her back several feet. Draco spared her a look.
"Loosen your hold."
He looked back, incredulous. "You've got to be kidding."
"It's like swimming," he said. "Trust the broom to carry you like you trust the current. Just float."
"The ocean won't send me plummeting to the ground."
"No," he agreed. "It will drown you."
Hermione bit her tongue but loosened her hold. The broom's tremors lessened. They watched until the first beam fell, caving in the roof over where they've discovered his parents' bodies. Cursed fire gouted into the sky. She could feel its heat, the sting unwelcome even in the chilled air. "We should go," she said. Draco nodded and turned his broom east. He flew abreast of him, velocity steady, destination undecided. The sky turned arch behind them, aglow with the setting sun, as the way ahead grew dark. Hermione flew closer and shouted over the wind. "There!" His eyes followed the point of her finger to a barn set amidst a fallow field. No light shone from the windows of its farmhouse, and no autos were parked in its long gravel drive. It looked abandoned. Draco dove at a steep angle towards the ground. Hermione took her time, flying a winding and smooth descent. Draco stood impatiently in the farmhouse's shadow, watching as she landed. She felt unsteady after so long in the air and walked stiffly towards the door. He unlocked it with a prod, pausing a moment to listen after the deadbolt disengaging with a thunk. She pulled the screen door wide and propped it open with a hip. The front door squealed on unoiled hinges as she eased it open. Her hominum revelio yielded no result. "It's safe," she said, stepping inside. Draco locked the door behind her and paced the ground level while she checked the upstairs. They reconvened at the landing.
"Clear," he confirmed. "There's a water pump out back and a bit of food in their underground cellar."
2 bedrooms, she reported, and there was a closet with a tub. Honest relief showed on his face. She felt the same way. It had been far too long since her last bath. They moved on individual tracks for a time, the separation much needed after 4 days of constant contact. Hermione magicked water into the tub, heated it, and had herself a soak, working out the kinks in her hair with an old bottle of shampoo she'd found beneath the sink. Finally clean, she scrunched new clothes from the bureau drawers. Previous tenants had been older, judging from the selection. Wool stockings, hardy denim trousers, flannel shirts with worn elbows. She chose a house dress for the night, a green tartan pattern that reminded her of Minerva McGonagall. It hung off her shoulders, shapeless and warm. Her hair hung loose and damp around her shoulders. Draco was downstairs in the kitchen. He looked up from his meal of baked potato, preserved peas, and salted jerky, his eyes wide with surprise. Comfortable? For the first time in a long time. She sat, fetching herself a plate. She spooned peas onto it and took a few slices of jerky. "Your potato is on the stove." He nodded towards the wood-burning stove behind them, which crackled with a cheery fire. Atop it sat an overturned pot. She lifted the lid and saw the promised potato, steam rising from its brown skin. She rolled it onto her plate with a fork. It felt like a peace offering. "Thank you." He cut it open and suffered a moment of internal debate before saying, "If you want to bathe after dinner, I can fill and warm the tub for you." She blushed and busied herself with a forkful of cold peas. The offer had sounded less awkward in her head. "Oh, I'd appreciate that." She nodded, and they passed the rest of the meal in silence. Draco surprised her by taking her plate to the sink, though she doubted he intended to wash it any more than she did. Their eyes met, and Hermione knew it was time to make good on her promise. It felt strangely domestic, extinguishing the downstairs lights and walking into the master bedroom with him. They had been forced into all sorts of intimacies over the past few days, gritty realities of coexistence that were glossed over in Odyssean tales. Sights, smells, and the sounds that crossed boundaries of propriety. Emotional breakdowns that would have damaged all but the strongest of friendships. But because they were unavoidable, they became, to a certain extent, unremarkable. This was different. This was a choice Hermione was making, to help him fulfill basic human needs for cleanliness. It was a task he could have accomplished manually. Could have made him pump the water, heat it slowly over the wood stove, and haul it up the stairs a few gallons at a time. The task would have left him exhausted, hardly able to enjoy his efforts. But it would have let her crawl beneath the moth-eaten sheets a few minutes sooner. Instead, she stood beside the clawfoot tub. Hot water poured from the tip of her wand as Draco leaned against the far wall, arms crossed over his chest, expression inscrutable. Once it was full, she turned to leave, barely able to meet his gaze. He stopped her with a hand as she passed. "Granger?" Her heart thudded against her ribcage, a swallow stuck in her throat. She looked up at him. "Don't go too far." He let her go once she nodded, and Hermione leaned against the closed door for a moment in an attempt to gather her composure. A composure which crumbled the moment she heard his clothes hit the floor. She hurried from the room, picking up his backpack and her drawstring pack on the way. Best not to think about what he might be doing in the bath. Performing an inventory would be an appropriate distraction. Hermione cast a light in the second bedroom and sat up on the bed. The old frame creaked as it took her weight, and the mattress sagged, its springs worn from age and use. She emptied both bags, surprised at how full they were. Draco had restocked their food supplies from Malfoy Manor's kitchens. They now had a selection of preserved fruits and vegetables, and enough meat, bread, and cheese to last several weeks. Taking a few sweets too. Several bars of chocolate, a large handful of soft caramels, a bag of candied ginger, a few loose mints. Hermione divided the stores out between them, then did the same with the book. Both packs were charmed to be feather-light, negating the issue of weight, but she did not want them to be resource-constrained if they were separated or if a bag were destroyed or lost. She was stowing the final items when Draco appeared at the threshold. Platinum blonde hair hung a little past his chin, pinned straight now that it was clean. He too had rummaged through the bureau and donned clothes several sizes too big. Drawstring flannels hung low on his hips, and an overlarge t-shirt showed an indecent amount of his collarbone. She'd seen him with less, much less. Perhaps it was the knowledge of what lay beneath his clothes that made her blush. I've reorganized, she said, as if it weren't obvious. Anything to break the drawing silence. Thank you for restocking us.
I didn't know how much we'd need. I tried to take enough for another week.
I don't think we'll need that long. Hermione unfolded herself from the bed and held the backpack out for him.
London?
He guessed. She nodded. You've already decided to leave them, and now they know it. There is nowhere else you can go. His eyes hardened, and Hermione realized too late that an ultimatum was the worst possible thing she could have given him. He snatched the bag from her, turned on his heels, and stormed across the hall to the master bedroom. She followed him, hand outstretched. Wait, that's not what
I'm not running to the door because I have to,
he said, tossing her an over-the-shoulder glare.
If I go at all, it will be because I've chosen to.
I know, that's what He rounded on her.
I didn't have a choice with them.
He spat, holding his left forearm between them.
I took the mark because it was expected, because if I didn't, something even worse would happen. Now that something worse has happened, I might have lost my family, but I still have my pride. I won't be used again.
I know.
I've learnt my lesson.
I know, Draco. She took his wrist and covered his dark mark with her own hand, depressing a shudder as the ink moved beneath her palm. I'm not going to force you into anything you're not comfortable with. I know what you've lost. My parents. Grief stopped at her throat. She forced the words through. They're gone too. I know how it feels to be unmoored. Like the water's rising and you don't know how to swim. I'm asking you to trust the other. They need you.
And you?
His eyes glittered like stars. She loosened her grip, unsure of what he was asking, of how much to yield. We need each other, she said, conscious of how that mission shifted the air between them. Let her fingers fall from his wrist and forearm, trailing across his skin. Sleep on it. We don't need to make any decisions tonight. Draco caught her wrist as she turned to leave.
Where are you going?
To the second bedroom.
No.
Her heart began to race again.
We're safer together, he said. And the bed is big enough for two.
He looked over his shoulder at a double white mattress. He was technically correct, but only just.
Close the door,
he said, negating the need for further conversation.
I'll draw the curtains.
He dropped their backs by the door, which he dutifully warded against intruders. The curtains blocked the faint light of the half-moon, and Hermione lit a temporary lumos to help them navigate the unfamiliar space. She averted her eyes as he drew the T-shirt over his head. She crawled into bed beside him and extinguished the light from her wand. Despite the lumpy mattress and the musty smell of the blanket, the bed was nicer than anything they'd had in days. Nevertheless, Hermione couldn't get comfortable. She felt cold despite their shared heat. Her every twitch and turn rustled the sheets, and her breathing sounded like gusts of wind in the silence. Worst of all, despite Draco not an inch away, she felt completely alone. Hermione stared at the faint grey shadows of the ceiling, silent tears dripping from the corners of her eyes and into her hair. So much had happened over the past few days. They'd been on the move constantly, forced to deal with emergency after emergency. They'd almost no time alone, no space in which to process.
Granger?
She thought she'd been quiet. She kept her hands at her sides. It was dark after all, and he couldn't see her tears. Better if she didn't know how much she was hurting. He swallowed enough of her grief to answer him. Yes.
Are you cold?
Hermione bit her tongue to keep from letting loose a sob.
You're shivering,
he said, as if reading her mind.
Do you want?
She knew what he offered and knew that she should refuse it. Whatever was building between them could never last. They'd shared too much history, too much trauma. But then Draco was all she had. When his arm wrapped around her waist, when he tucked her head beneath his chin and nestled her snugly against his chest, Hermione could almost forget who they were and what they'd endured. She could almost imagine a life with him. A small cottage near the sea, a simple life of honest labor and warm words, where she woke to the scent of salt and spice in the arms of a man who knew her. She released her breath, relaxed against him, let herself sink into the dream. To be continued. Thank you for listening to this chapter of Time and Tide by Misdemeanor1331. If you'd like to stay up to date on upcoming chapters and stories, you can follow me on YouTube, Spotify, or AO3.